Have you ever felt trapped? Like stuck in a way of thinking that you just replay the same patterns and thoughts and choices over and over again? Or you find yourself stuck in a habit, something that you've been doing for so long that you don't even know that you could change it if you wanted to. Or have you ever felt captive to like a relationship or a job or maybe even your personal finances or debt? We all find ourselves in these times of our lives where we're stuck in the same patterns of thoughts and behaviors. Me too. And what happens is that when we find ourselves trapped, when we find ourselves stuck and captive, we all want deliverance from whatever it is that's holding us back, that's holding us captive. And so for the next 4 weeks, this is what we're going to do here in our Exodus study. We're going to talk about the things that keep us trapped and how God's work in our life is deeper than our circumstances. The journey starts when we hear the words of God's promise in our lives about all those places that you feel stuck, trapped, captive, all of those places. God enters into those places. And we're going to learn about who we are through the book of Exodus, and even more importantly, God's continual and ongoing work of liberation for you, for me, and for the world. As we explore the book of Exodus, we're going to discover the road to freedom. Hey, welcome to the book of Exodus. Today, we're going to be looking at the backstory of this really epic story. I'm so excited to dive into it with you. Maybe you've seen it before. You've heard the story. You watched the 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston, or maybe if you had kids like around my kids' old age, they watched The Prince of Egypt, this animated classic. And it's no wonder that Hollywood has adapted this because this is an incredible story. It's really an epic story about what God does through God's people in the book of Exodus. We're so excited to jump in with it with you. Before we get going in the book of Exodus, we really got to know how God's people ended up in Egypt. And it starts in the book before it, the first book of the Bible, in Genesis. In Genesis, God makes a promise to God's chosen person, Abraham. And then that promise continues to Abraham's son, Isaac, and then Isaac's son, Jacob. Now, Jacob, he ends up becoming Israel is his name. God changes his name. And that's why we have the story of the Israelites. They're the tribes of Jacob. Jacob, he has 12 sons and one daughter. And there's one of those sons who's kind of arrogant. His name is Joseph. He's arrogant and his brothers don't like him. So they sell him into slavery and he ends up in Egypt. So Joseph's in Egypt and he's a slave, but then they find out that God's doing some work and he's got some gifts when it comes to interpreting dreams. Joseph, he ends up meeting with the Pharaoh of Egypt at that time, and he interprets a dream for the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh had this dream where there were 7 fat cows that were swallowed up by 7 skinny cows. And what Joseph interpreted was that meant that there were going to be 7 bountiful years and then 7 years of famine after that. The Pharaoh is so impressed with Joseph that he promotes Joseph to the second in command and makes him responsible for making sure they store the grain for in preparation for this coming drought. Now, Joseph's whole family, all his brothers and all their families and all their wives and children and all of that, they're still not in Egypt yet. But when the famine hits, they come in search for food. And that's when they reunite with their brother Joseph. And in this reuniting, that is when all the Israelites are welcome to come live in the land of Egypt. This is where we are picking up here today in chapter 1. Now, the Israelites, they're living in Egypt and they are bountiful and they're thriving and things are really good for them until all of a sudden things are not good for them. Joseph dies, generations die, and a new king comes to be part of, to rule over them. And he doesn't really like the Israelites, so he enslaves them. Now, the word Exodus, it literally translates to mean going out. Or in the English, we use the word exit. The book of Exodus, it has 3 parts. The first part is where God hears the Israelites cry and responds to it. The second part is Israel kind of claiming their new identity as free people. And the third talks about how do we encounter and worship God in their new life. And this journey that the Israelites take, it mirrors the journey that we all take in our faith lives too. You could put it this way. It starts with slavery, and then salvation, and then Sabbath. Slavery, salvation, Sabbath. I'll give you an example of how it's worked in my life. After my first marriage ended terribly, I found myself still in slavery, still captive and trapped stuck in my thoughts, stuck in my perspectives about who I was as a person and how I acted, how I looked, how I felt. I felt myself trapped in that moment. Until one day, I realized that God was working through God's thing for me. And I realized that what if I just believed what God saw about me instead of the things that I saw about me? And God put people in my life to help me see that as well, which meant that I was saved from those toxic thoughts, which meant that I was saved. But when I was freed, I felt and experienced salvation. But then it was only when I was freed that I realized that I could rest. I didn't have to hustle anymore to care about how I felt about myself. I could rest in God's loving embrace about who I was. It was in gratitude that I knew that God kept God's promises about everything. Slavery, salvation, Sabbath. It's this pattern that we hear in this story, and it's the pattern that you'll hear in a lot of stories throughout the Bible. Maybe you've heard it this way: suffering, crucifixion, resurrection. Watch for this pattern as you read the book of Exodus. So the Israelites, they're now in Egypt, and Joseph has died, and the original Pharaoh, he died as well. So now the Israelites are subjects to this new king, and this king isn't kind of them. King doesn't like how well they work, how much they can be fruitful and multiply, and so he becomes threatened by the presence of the Israelites. So he forces them into labor. And the Egyptians, they started to fear them. And so they called the Israelites, another name that we hear for them are the Hebrews. It's the same people as you read it. So the king of Egypt, you'll notice when you're reading these first two chapters, the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, he's not named. He's never named in this book. But the Pharaoh, as you're starting to read, starts to put these people into slavery. And as he's getting jealous, he goes to two of the Hebrew midwives. Their names are named in this part of Scripture. Their names are Shiphrah and Puah. He goes to Shiphrah and Puah, and he says to them, if any Hebrew woman gives birth to a boy, that they should throw that baby into the Nile, that they should kill that baby. But if they give birth to a girl, that girl is allowed to live. Now, in Hebrew culture, in Israelite culture, the family line follows the male line. And so essentially what he's trying to do is kill off the entire family line. But here's the thing. The women, Shiphrah and Puah, they refuse to do this. They sit there and say a hard no. Now, in verse 20, we get to see the first mention of God and God's work in this book of Exodus, where God deals strongly with the midwives and comes to them, and they become very strong. So God's first interactions in the book of Exodus is through these midwives, through women who would have very little status in that culture at all. And in chapter 2 is when we start to learn about Moses. Now, Moses' dad is named Amram, and his mom's name is significant. His mom's name is Jochebed. We learn this later in chapter 6. But his mother's name, that Jochebed, is significant because she is the first one in this book of Exodus to have that Yah name, that Yah that is associated with Yahweh or God. And so her role is significant. We get all kinds of these echoes of what God is doing through these first couple of chapters. It's really beautiful, really. It's got all these incredible complex layers to it. It's going to be so fun for you to dive in and read of God being in, among, and through all of it. So when Jochebed, when the woman who's got God's name in her name, when Jochebed gives birth to Moses, she stands up to the king and refuses to kill the boy. Instead, she looks and says, oh, because he is a good boy. When he says that, she's echoing back to Genesis, where God created all of us, you and I, as good, back to our original identity of God. It's beautiful and complicated, isn't it? Now, Jochebed, she defies the king's orders, and she doesn't kill her son, but instead she puts him in a basket, and it's this reed basket. But in the original Hebrew language, the same word for that basket is the word that is used for ark that we hear about in Genesis from Noah. It's that same word. So she puts her boy into this protective ark, this protective basket, and she goes and puts him among the reeds in the river. And now the reeds in the river, it's another beautiful word in its original Hebrew. The reeds of the river, they actually mean the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds. It's the same words being used over and over as God is weaving this story in its beautiful complexity. Now, I can't wait for you to see what happens next after she puts her boy in this ark basket and puts him into the reeds, the Sea of Reeds, the Red Sea. It's this incredible story. So go in and read chapters 1 and 2 and find out what happens next. It's the story of Moses and the Exodus and freedom for all of us. Here's my questions as we get started today. Number 1, what's got you trapped or enslaved? Where in your life do you find yourself feeling stuck? And number 2, is there any chance that when you look back on your life, do you see God's echo in there, where God pulled this one thing and weaved this one thing and put them together? We're so glad that you're joining us for our Exodus study. This was a big first one. I wanted you to make sure you had all the backstory. Go and visit our website, which is calvaryalex.com/study, and there you're going to find additional resources and materials to accompany you through this Exodus study. We're so glad that you're here.